What if the key to catching a killer wasn't a fingerprint but a voice? What if the evidence that blew a case wide open wasn't found under a microscope but on a cassette tape played in a hushed police station? For some of Britain's most infamous serial killers, their own words, or the words of a devilish imposter, would be their downfall. But sound can be deceiving. A voice can seem to promise a breakthrough, only to lead an entire investigation into darkness, allowing a monster to continue his reign of terror. This is the story of the chilling confessions, the secret wiretaps, and the hoax calls that define the hunts for Britain's most notorious murderers. We'll uncover how recorded words became both the ultimate weapon for justice and the perfect tool for deception. From a tape that fooled an entire nation to the quiet confessions that exposed a house of horrors, this is the story of the recordings that unmasked the monsters living among us. Central thesis: the history of British true crime is littered with pivotal moments, but some of the most dramatic turning points weren't discoveries at a crime scene. They were moments a play button was pressed. We're about to explore how audio evidence has shaped some of the most significant serial killer cases in the UK. Sometimes a tape exposes a killer, and sometimes, as we're about to see, it protects one with devastating consequences. The tape that fooled a nation. Between 1975 and 1980, a shadow fell over the north of England. A killer, dubbed the Yorkshire Ripper by the press, was preying on women, sparking one of the largest and most desperate manhunts in British history. Peter Sutcliffe, a lorry driver from Bradford, murdered 13 women and was convicted for attempting to kill 7 more.
The serial killer Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, has died in hospital at the age of 74. He had coronavirus. Sutcliffe murdered 13 women across Yorkshire and the northwest of England between 1975 and 1980. He was also convicted of the attempted murder of 7 other women. This report from our correspondent Danny Savage contains some flashing images.
His attacks were brutal, and the fear he instilled was palpable. Women were warned not to go out at night. The police, under immense public pressure, were getting nowhere. They had interviewed thousands of men and followed countless leads, but the Ripper remained a ghost. Then, in June of 1979, after 4 years of dead ends and mounting public fury, a package arrived for Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield, the man leading the investigation. Inside was a cassette tape. On it, a man with a gravelly, distinctive accent spoke directly to Oldfield. His chilling opening words would become infamous. "I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George. But Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started."
"I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George. But Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George."
For the beleaguered West Yorkshire police, this tape felt like a miracle. The voice was eerie, taunting, and seemed to possess knowledge of the crimes. The accent was pinpointed by linguistic experts as being from the Wearside area of Sunderland. This was it. The breakthrough. Police were now convinced they were hunting for a man with a Geordie accent. They launched a massive publicity campaign, playing the tape for the public and plastering billboards across the north, appealing for information on the man who became known as Wearside Jack. The investigation, which had been floundering, now had a laser-like focus. Find the man with that voice. But this breakthrough was, in reality, a catastrophic diversion. The voice on the tape did not belong to the Yorkshire Ripper. Find the man with that voice. But this breakthrough was, in reality, a catastrophic diversion. The voice on the tape did not belong to the Yorkshire Ripper. It belonged to a man named John Humble, an unemployed labourer from Sunderland with a morbid fascination for the original Jack the Ripper. Bored and likely drunk, he had sent the tape and a series of letters as a prank. The consequences of this hoax were devastating. Convinced of the tape's authenticity, police shifted their focus to the Wearside region. While they vetted around 40,000 men in total, the accent became a crucial filter, causing them to deprioritise or dismiss anyone who didn't fit the audio profile. This included the real killer, Peter Sutcliffe. He had already been interviewed by police 9 times in connection with the inquiry, but because he was a Yorkshireman without a trace of a Wearside accent, he was repeatedly dismissed as a suspect. As police chased this phantom, Sutcliffe continued to kill. After the Wearside Jack tape was made public, he murdered 3 more women: Josephine Whitaker, Barbara Leach, and Jacqueline Hill. These women might have been saved. The judge at John Humble's trial would later state that Sutcliffe's final victims would have had a better chance of survival had the police not been misled. Sutcliffe himself admitted after his capture that the hoax made him feel safe. He told police, "While ever that was going on, I felt safe. I'm not a Geordie." The truth is, even at the time, there were doubts. Some phonetics experts warned the police that the tape could be a hoax, and external advisors, including profilers from the FBI, reportedly advised them that the recording was likely fake. But the police, desperate for a lead, clung to it. The hoaxer, John Humble, racked with guilt after another murder was announced, even phoned the police anonymously to tell them it was a hoax, but the call was dismissed. He later attempted suicide by jumping from a bridge, but survived. The Yorkshire Ripper was not caught because of the tape. He was caught by chance. On January 2nd, 1981, a police officer in Sheffield stopped Sutcliffe's car because it had false number plates. With him in the car was a prostitute, Olivia Rivers. During questioning, Sutcliffe's physical characteristics matched the description of the Ripper, and he eventually confessed to the 13 murders. The tape hadn't exposed the killer. It had shielded him, prolonging his reign of terror and costing at least 3 women their lives. John Humble was finally brought to justice in 2005 when a DNA sample from one of the hoax letter envelopes matched his on the national database. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. The Wearside Jack tape remains the most notorious hoax in British criminal history. A haunting reminder of how a single recorded voice could derail one of the biggest manhunts the country had ever seen. The tapes that uncovered a house of horrors. Sometimes the tape isn't a single recording, but a vast, chilling archive of words that slowly peels back the layers of unimaginable evil. This was exactly the case at 25 Cromwell Street, Gloucester, the home of Fred and Rose West. To their neighbours, they were an ordinary, if slightly odd, family. But behind closed doors, they were one of Britain's most depraved and prolific killer couples. Their house of horrors began to unravel not because of a dramatic chase, but through rumours that Fred had killed his daughter, Heather, and buried her in the garden. When police arrived in February 1994 with a search warrant, Fred West was shockingly nonchalant. When an officer mentioned that family talk suggested Heather was under the patio, he just chuckled and said, "Oh, for God's sake, you're digging me place up, so carry on doing it." He initially confessed only to Heather's murder, but as police began their painstaking excavation of the garden and cellar, the true scale of the horror emerged. One body was found, then another and another. In total, the remains of 9 young women were unearthed at 25 Cromwell Street, with more victims discovered at other locations linked to Fred. The tapes in this case were the hundreds of hours of police interviews conducted with Fred West. Unlike many suspects who stay silent, Fred talked almost endlessly. He spun a web of lies, contradictions, and half-truths, but woven within his rambling narratives were shocking admissions. He led police to the graves of his victims, describing his crimes in a disturbingly matter-of-fact tone. These recorded interviews became the primary evidence against him, a permanent record of his monstrous deeds, and gave investigators an unprecedented window into the mind of a serial killer. The audio tapes captured his manipulative personality perfectly. He could be jovial one moment and menacing the next, attempting to control the narrative even as the bodies of his victims were being carried from his home. These recordings were crucial because they preserved not just what he said, but how he said it. The chilling lack of emotion, the casual cruelty. However, the full story would never be told by Fred. On New Year's Day, 1995, before he could stand trial, Fred West died by suicide in his prison cell. His death left a gaping void in the investigation. He had been the one talking, the one confessing. Now the case against his wife, Rose West, rested on proving her involvement. Rose had maintained her innocence, painting herself as just another of Fred's victims. The interview tapes with Fred became even more critical. Prosecutors and investigators had to sift through his recorded words, cross-referencing them with other evidence to build their case against her. the tapes became a ghostly testament, with Fred's voice from beyond the grave helping to seal his wife's fate. The recordings of interviews with the West children and other witnesses also became vital pillars in the case, their voices adding to the chorus of evidence that dismantled Rose's claims of ignorance. She was convicted in November 1995 for her role in 10 of the murders and sentenced to life in prison. The West case didn't have a single dramatic Wearside Jack tape. Instead, it had an archive of quiet, methodical recordings, hours of interviews that documented the slow, horrifying unraveling of decades of depravity. These tapes ensure that even after his death, Fred West's own words would be the final, damning evidence of the horrors committed at 25 Cromwell Street. When the tape is silence. Not all of Britain's worst killers were unmasked by a voice on a tape. Sometimes the most damning evidence is the trail they leave behind, a trail of paper, of suspicious patterns, or of grisly physical discoveries that speak far louder than any confession. For some of Britain's most prolific murderers, their exposure came from the silence where a normal record should be, and the evidence that screamed out in its place. Take Dr. Harold Shipman, a respected family GP in Hyde, Greater Manchester. He wasn't caught because of a taunting phone call or a secret recording. He was Britain's most prolific serial killer, believed to have murdered over 200 of his patients, and he was exposed by a piece of paper. For years, Shipman operated with impunity. His victims were predominantly elderly women, and he would administer lethal doses of diamorphine or pharmaceutical heroin before certifying their deaths as due to old age or natural causes. Since he was their doctor, his word was rarely questioned. The tape that incriminated Shipman was a forged will. In 1998, after the death of 81-year-old Kathleen Grundy, a former mayoress of Hyde, her daughter, a solicitor named Angela Woodruff, became suspicious. A clumsily typed will had surfaced, leaving Mrs. Grundy's entire £386,000 estate to Dr. Shipman. Woodruff knew her mother would never do such a thing. The will was a cack-handed attempt at forgery, riddled with errors and typed on a battered old manual typewriter that police later found in Shipman's surgery. This single document unravelled everything. Police began an investigation, exhuming Kathleen Grundy's body and finding lethal levels of diamorphine. They then looked at the wider pattern of his patients' deaths. The true evidence was in the data. An abnormally high death rate, a startling number of his patients dying at home in the afternoon, and medical records that had been altered after their deaths to create false histories of poor health, a fact discovered by a computer audit trail. Shipman was convicted in 2015 murders, but an official inquiry concluded he was responsible for at least 215. His downfall wasn't a voice, but a greedy, amateurish forgery and the cold, hard data he left behind. Then there's the case of Dennis Nilsen, another of Britain's most notorious serial killers, who murdered at least 15 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983. Nilsen was a lonely civil servant who lured vulnerable men back to his London flats where he would strangle them. For years, his crimes went completely unnoticed. Nilsen's undoing wasn't a tape, but a smell. In February 1983, tenants at his apartment building at 23 Cranley Gardens complained about the drains. A plumber was called. When he opened a drain cover outside, he found a gruesome blockage of what appeared to be flesh and small bones. He initially thought they were from an animal, but on a second visit, it was clear they were human. The police were called. When confronted, Nilsen's response was shockingly calm. He immediately confessed, telling detectives where to find the rest of the body parts. His subsequent confessions, recorded in detail, became a chilling tape of their own, as he narrated his life and horrific crimes with a detached, bureaucratic air. But the catalyst for his capture was purely physical. He was caught not because of what he said, but because of his grotesque method of disposal. The blocked drains of Muswell Hill were the evidence that finally gave a voice to his silent victims. Both Shipman and Nilsen demonstrate that sometimes the most damning evidence is the absence of a normal record, replaced by something profoundly wrong. A forged will, an altered medical file, or human remains where they should not be. The silence is the tell. Conclusion. From the deceptive voice on a cassette tape that sent police on a wild goose chase, to the endless hours of chilling interview recordings that pieced together a story of unimaginable depravity, the role of the tape in British true crime is complex and powerful. The hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper shows us how a recording, when wielded with malicious intent, can become a weapon of misdirection, shielding a killer and costing innocent lives. Conversely, the case of Fred and Rose West demonstrates the power of recorded testimony to preserve a killer's own words, ensuring that even from beyond the grave, their voice can be used to secure justice. And in the stories of Harold Shipman and Dennis Nielsen, we see that sometimes the most revealing evidence isn't a recording at all, but the stark, undeniable proof that emerges when patterns are analysed and physical reality is confronted. These tapes, whether literal audio recordings or the metaphorical records of a killer's actions, do more than just solve crimes. They shape our memory of them. They allow us to hear the taunts of a hoaxer, the calm admissions of a monster, and the meticulous accounts of the investigators who brought them down. They are a permanent, chilling testament to the moment a killer's world began to unravel. The spoken word holds immense power. It can deceive, it can confess, and it can condemn. These cases force us to question not just the evidence we see, but the voices we choose to believe. They remind us that behind every notorious case, there is a story of how the truth, one way or another, finally found a way to be heard. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into the cases that shaped British criminal history.